The return to the estate. The iron gates of the Kingsley estate loomed ahead, an imposing structure that stood as a testament to the wealth, power, and history of one of the most influential families in the country. As the sleek black limousine rolled up the long gravel driveway, Nicholas Kingsley leaned back against the plush leather seat, exhaling slowly. It had been years, long, grueling years, since he had last set foot here. Years spent forging his own destiny, carving his name into the world of business with a level of success that even his ancestors would have envied. Now he was returning, not just as a man of triumph, but as a husband. Seated beside him, Isabel Kingsley, his elegant and strikingly beautiful wife, ran her perfectly manicured fingers over the leather armrest of the car, her lips pursed in mild disapproval. Isabel had married Nicholas for his wealth, his name, and the power it carried. But as the grand estate came into view, a flicker of something unreadable crossed her eyes. It was opulent, certainly, vast rolling gardens, towering pillars, and a mansion that seemed to stretch beyond sight. But in her world, luxury was nothing new. What mattered was control, social status, and ensuring she was always the most revered woman in the room. "This is it," she murmured, her tone smooth but edged with quiet critique. Nicholas glanced at her, his sharp blue eyes briefly studying her expression. He knew Isabel well enough to understand the underlying meaning behind her words. She had envisioned something more extravagant, perhaps a modern glass fortress or a castle on a remote island. The Kingsley estate, however, was built on heritage, tradition, and old money, not the ostentatious displays of new wealth she was accustomed to. "You expected something else?" he asked coolly. She tilted her head, offering a tight smile. "No, darling. It's just charmingly rustic. I suppose it has sentimental value for you." Nicholas chuckled under his breath. "You could say that." The car came to a smooth stop before the grand entrance, where butlers in crisp uniforms lined up in perfect formation, ready to receive them. The main doors opened before Nicholas even stepped out, revealing the stately figure of his mother, Eleanor Kingsley. Even in her late 60s, she carried herself with a regal poise that made it clear she was the matriarch of the family. "Nicholas," Eleanor said, her voice warm but composed, as she stepped forward. "Welcome home, my dear." Nicholas embraced his mother briefly before stepping aside to introduce Isabel. "Mother, this is Isabel," he said. Eleanor's gaze flicked over Isabel with practiced ease, taking in every detail: the designer dress, the diamonds adorning her fingers, the calculated smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's a pleasure," Eleanor said, offering a polite but firm handshake. "The pleasure is mine," Isabel replied, her voice smooth as silk. As the pleasantries concluded, Nicholas's eyes swept across the grand foyer. The marble floors gleamed, the grand chandelier sparkled, and the scent of fresh roses filled the air. Yet beyond all of that, his gaze landed on a figure standing slightly behind the staff, watching quietly with the same gentle eyes that had comforted him through childhood nightmares. Martha, his childhood nanny. She stood there in her modest uniform, her hands clasped in front of her, a warm yet uncertain smile on her weathered face. She had aged since he last saw her, but the kindness in her eyes was just the same. She had raised him when his own parents were too busy managing the family empire. She had been the one to hold him when he was sick, to wipe his tears when he scraped his knee, to tuck him into bed with whispered lullabies. "Martha," Nicholas said, his voice thick with emotion as he stepped forward. Her lips trembled as she smiled wider. "Oh, my sweet boy," she said, her voice warm with affection. "Look at you, so grown up, so successful. I always knew you would be." Without hesitation, Nicholas pulled her into a heartfelt hug. "Don't call me boy anymore, Martha," he murmured. "I'm a man now, but I'm still your Nicholas." Martha laughed, her voice laced with emotion. "You will always be my boy." The moment was tender, filled with genuine love and appreciation. but it did not sit well with Isabel. She stood a few steps behind, arms crossed, her expression unreadable, but her posture stiff with disapproval. To her, it was absurd that her husband, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the country, was embracing a mere servant so openly. What did it say about his stature, his dignity, the Kingsley name? Isabel cleared her throat lightly, breaking the moment. Nicholas pulled back from Martha and turned to his wife. "Isabel," he said, "this is Martha. She practically raised me." Martha bowed her head slightly. "It's an honor to meet you, ma'am." Isabel's smile was razor thin. "Oh, how sweet. You must have been very useful to Nicholas when he was a child." Nicholas's brow furrowed slightly at the phrasing, but Martha, ever the gracious one, simply nodded. "I did my best, ma'am," she replied humbly. Isabel's eyes flickered over her, taking in the simple uniform, the gray streaks in her hair, the slightly roughened hands from years of hard work. "How long have you been here, Martha?" Isabel asked, her tone laced with something Nicholas didn't quite like. Martha hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Nearly 40 years, Mom." Isabel let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "That long? My goodness, that's dedication. Though, I suppose some people grow too attached to places they should have left behind a long time ago." The comment was subtle, but the sting was there. Nicholas's jaw tightened, but before he could say anything, Martha simply smiled. "This estate has been my home as much as it has been Nicholas's," Martha said gently. "Well," Isabel said, placing a delicate hand on Nicholas's arm, "I'm sure times have changed. Nicholas is a man now, after all. He doesn't need a nanny anymore." The words were coated in silk but sharp enough to cut. A silent message. "You are obsolete." Nicholas's eyes darkened, but Martha merely nodded, as if she had heard far worse in her lifetime. "Of course," Martha said softly. "Things do change." Nicholas took a deep breath, turning to Isabel. "Why don't you head inside? I'd like to have a moment to catch up with Martha." Isabel's smile barely wavered, but he could see the flicker of irritation in her eyes. "Of course, darling," she said smoothly, pressing a quick kiss to his cheek before striding inside. As soon as she disappeared into the house, Nicholas turned back to Martha. "Ignore her," he said quietly. Martha shook her head with a small smile. "She's your wife, Nicholas. It's not my place." Nicholas sighed. "She doesn't know you like I do. She doesn't understand." Martha patted his arm gently. "She will, in time." But Nicholas wasn't so sure. And deep down, something told him that this was only the beginning of a storm brewing beneath the surface. The unseen storm. The grand chandelier in the Kingsley Estate's dining hall cast a golden glow across the long, polished mahogany table. Crystal glasses shimmered under the light, and an array of silverware gleamed against the pristine white tablecloth. The room exuded wealth, tradition, and power, the very things Isabel had envisioned when she married Nicholas. Yet there was something about this house, about the people who inhabited it, that unsettled her. Martha. That old woman had been far too familiar with Nicholas, and worse, he had embraced her in a way that made Isabel's stomach twist. It wasn't that she was jealous of some aging nanny. It was the way Nicholas had looked at her, with warmth, with affection. It was the same expression he should reserve for his wife, not for some servant who should have retired decades ago. She had spent years perfecting her image, learning how to command respect in elite circles, how to carry herself with an air of sophistication that made others feel beneath her. And yet tonight, sitting at the Kingsley family table, she felt a strange irritation bubbling beneath her calm exterior. Martha should know her place. She had to. Nicholas sat at the head of the table, his sharp blue eyes observing his family as the dinner progressed. His mother, Eleanor Kingsley, carried the conversation with the effortless grace of a woman who had been born into aristocracy. She spoke of investments, charities, and social engagements, all while sipping her wine with precise, measured movements. Across from Eleanor sat his father, Charles Kingsley, a man of few words but immense authority. Even at 70, he maintained the air of a ruler, a patriarch whose word was law. He spoke sparingly, nodding occasionally as Eleanor kept the conversation flowing. And then there was Isabel, poised and flawless, offering the occasional comment to show she was listening. Though Nicholas could see her mind was elsewhere. She was calculating, always calculating. The only person missing from the table was Martha. He frowned, glancing toward the kitchen. It wasn't uncommon for the staff to eat separately, but Martha had always been treated as family. When he was younger, she had dined with him in the evenings, offering soft words of encouragement when his father's expectations felt too overwhelming. "Something wrong, dear?" Isabel's voice was smooth, almost too smooth. Nicholas turned his attention back to her, forcing a small smile. "Just thinking." "About?" she prodded. Before he could respond, the doors to the dining hall swung open, and one of the maids stepped inside, carefully balancing a tray of tea and desserts. Nicholas caught a glimpse of Martha behind her, arranging plates in the adjoining room. "Martha," he called, and she immediately looked up. She hesitated briefly before stepping inside, wiping her hands on her apron. "Yes, Nicholas." His mother cleared her throat lightly, a silent reminder that servants were not meant to interrupt formal meals. But Nicholas ignored it. "Why aren't you joining us?" he asked. Martha gave him a gentle smile. "Oh, my dear boy, I have work to do. Besides, this is a family dinner." "You are family," he said firmly. Martha's smile faltered for just a moment, as if she wanted to believe his words but knew better. "Nicholas," Eleanor interjected with a composed tone, "Martha prefers to be where she is most comfortable. You know that." Nicholas glanced between his mother and Martha. He knew the unspoken rule. Servants, no matter how cherished, remained servants. But that rule had never applied to Martha in his eyes. Isabel, sensing the tension, took a sip of her wine before speaking. "I think it's lovely how much you care for your childhood, Nanny, darling. Not everyone is so sentimental." The word sentimental hung in the air like a veiled insult. Nicholas caught the subtle jab, but before he could respond, Martha gently patted his shoulder. "It's all right, Nicholas. Enjoy your dinner." And with that, she disappeared into the kitchen. Nicholas clenched his jaw. Something about the way she had said those words didn't sit right with him. There was a quiet resignation in her voice, as if she had long accepted her place as something lesser, despite all she had done for him. His grip on the silverware tightened. After dinner, as the guests retired to the drawing room for drinks, Isabel excused herself, claiming she wanted to freshen up. In reality, she had other intentions. She made her way down the dimly lit hallway, her heels clicking softly against the marble floors. The estate was vast, but Isabel had memorized its layout quickly. She knew exactly where she was going. The servants' quarters. She found Martha in the small kitchen, carefully arranging tea leaves into a container. The room smelled of chamomile and lavender, and there was something almost unnervingly peaceful about the scene. Martha looked up when she heard Isabel enter. "Mrs. Kingsley," she greeted politely, straightening her posture. Isabel's red lips curved into a practiced smile. "Martha, we didn't get a chance to talk earlier." Martha nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "No, ma'am, we didn't." There was a brief pause before Isabel stepped closer, her sharp gaze locking onto Martha's. "You've been here for a very long time, haven't you?" "Yes, Mom," Martha said, keeping her tone neutral. "And Nicholas, he seems quite fond of you." Martha's smile remained, but her eyes carried a knowing look. "I raised him." "Yes, I can see that," Isabel said coolly. "But things change, don't they? Nicholas is a married man now. He has different priorities, new responsibilities." Martha remained silent. "I wouldn't want him to feel torn between the past and the future," Isabel continued, her voice laced with the sweet venom of implied authority. "You understand what I mean, don't you?" Martha looked at her for a long moment before nodding. "Of course, Mom." Isabel leaned in slightly. Good. Then you won't mind keeping your place. Martha's expression didn't waver, but Isabel saw the flicker of something deep in her eyes. Not fear, not defiance. Something else. Understanding. Martha had dealt with women like Isabel before. She knew exactly what this was. Yes, ma'am, Martha said again, her voice soft but firm. I know my place. Isabel smiled. I'm glad to hear it. With that, she turned on her heel and left, satisfied that her message had been received. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly anticipate, was that her condescending words, her veiled threats, had set something into motion that would change everything. Because Nicholas had heard every word. He had been standing just outside the door. His jaw was clenched, his heart pounding. And for the first time in a long time, a slow, cold fury burned in his chest. Isabel had just made the worst mistake of her life. She had underestimated the woman who had raised him. And worse, she had underestimated him. The breaking point. Nicholas stood frozen outside the servants' quarters, his fingers curled into tight fists at his sides. He had heard every single word of Isabel's condescending conversation with Martha, every veiled insult, every arrogant dismissal. His wife had made a grave mistake. Nicholas had spent his entire life being told who to be, how to behave, and what was expected of a Kingsley. From a young age, he had learned that money and power meant control, that his name alone opened doors others could only dream of. But if there was one thing he had never tolerated, it was cruelty, especially toward those who had given him nothing but love. Martha had been his rock when no one else was there. When his parents had been too busy attending galas and running the empire, she had been the one who held him when he cried, who made sure he ate when stress made him lose his appetite, who whispered stories about kindness and honor before tucking him into bed. And now his wife, the woman he had chosen to spend his life with, had dared to belittle her. A cold fury settled in his chest as he turned away and strode down the dimly lit hallway, his mind racing. He needed to act. Not out of anger, not out of impulse, but because this was a line that should never have been crossed. A mother's warning. As Nicholas entered the grand drawing room, the soft hum of conversation met his ears. His parents sat near the fireplace, engaged in quiet discussion, while Isabel sipped her wine, a picture of poised elegance. If he hadn't just overheard her cruelty, he might have believed the illusion she so carefully crafted. Eleanor Kingsley, his mother, turned her gaze toward him as he walked in. The flickering firelight cast shadows across her high cheekbones, her shrewd eyes narrowing slightly as she read the storm brewing behind her son's composed exterior. "Nicholas," she said smoothly, "you look troubled." He poured himself a drink, swirling the amber liquid in his glass before taking a slow sip. "Just thinking," he replied, voice deceptively calm. His mother watched him, then glanced toward Isabel. There was an unspoken understanding between women like them. Women who wielded power through influence rather than force. "Nicholas," Eleanor said, setting her glass down with precision. "Come with me for a moment." Nicholas followed his mother out onto the balcony, the cool night air biting against his skin. Below them, the estate grounds stretched for miles, bathed in moonlight. "I assume this is about Martha," Eleanor said without preamble. Nicholas didn't bother to feign ignorance. "Yes," his mother sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of the marble railing. "Nicholas, you know I adore Martha. She has been with this family longer than I have, but she is a servant. And Isabel, well, she was raised differently." "That's no excuse," he said sharply. Eleanor's lips curved slightly, though it wasn't a smile. "No, it isn't, but it is reality. You married a woman who values status above all else. Did you expect her to treat Martha like an equal?" "She doesn't have to treat her like an equal," Nicholas said, his voice dangerously low. "She just has to treat her with respect." His mother studied him, then sighed. "You intend to do something about this?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. Eleanor was silent for a moment before nodding. Then do it well. Make sure she understands. She didn't ask what he planned. She didn't try to dissuade him, because she knew her son. And she knew that when Nicholas Kingsley made up his mind, nothing could stop him. The morning after. The next morning, Isabel woke to the smell of fresh coffee and the soft glow of the early sun filtering through the grand bedroom's floor-to-ceiling windows. She stretched luxuriously, letting the silk sheets slide against her skin before reaching for her phone. No messages. Frowning slightly, she glanced at the empty space beside her. Nicholas wasn't in bed. She slipped into her robe and stepped out onto the balcony, expecting to see him taking an early morning call or reading the news, but the terrace was empty. Where was he? A quiet knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. One of the maids entered, her posture stiff. "Madam, Mr. Kingsley requests your presence in the main hall." Isabel raised an eyebrow. "Now?" "Yes, Mom." Curious, she made her way downstairs. As she entered the hall, she stopped short. Nicholas stood at the center of the grand room, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Behind him, two uniformed men, estate security, stood with composed indifference. And beside them, Martha. The older woman held a small suitcase in her hands, her face calm but tired. A sinking feeling twisted in Isabel's stomach. "Nicholas," she said slowly, stepping forward. "What is this?" He met her gaze, his blue eyes cold as steel. "This," he said evenly, "is the consequence of your actions." She blinked. "I don't understand." Nicholas gestured toward Martha. "You humiliated her. You spoke to her as if she were nothing. You assumed that because she is a servant, she does not matter." He took a step closer, his voice dangerously quiet. "You thought I wouldn't hear. You thought I wouldn't care." Isabel's jaw tightened. "Nicholas, I only meant. I don't care what you meant." He cut her off. "You crossed a line. And now you're going to learn what it means to disrespect someone I love." She flinched. Love. Not past tense. Not nostalgia. Love. "You can't be serious," she whispered, her voice losing its usual polished veneer. "Oh, I'm very serious," Nicholas said. He turned to Martha, his voice softer. "Martha, you've given this family your entire life. You deserve better than to be treated like a piece of furniture." Martha hesitated. "Nicholas, No," he said firmly. "I won't let you spend another day in a house where you are not cherished." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This is yours." Martha took it hesitantly, her eyes widening as she peeked inside. Isabel caught a glimpse of the contents, stacks of bills, thick enough to be life-changing. "You're free, Martha," Nicholas said. "Go wherever you want. Buy a home. Travel. Live your life." Martha's hands trembled. "Nicholas, I never needed." "You took care of me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Now let me take care of you." Tears welled in Martha's eyes, but she nodded, holding the envelope to her chest. Isabel's heart pounded. "Nicholas, you're rewarding her. After." He turned on her, his voice sharp. "After you tried to belittle her. After you thought you could treat her like dirt and face no consequences." She swallowed hard. "Nicholas, she's just a—" "Don't finish that sentence," he warned. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Nicholas exhaled and turned to security. "Take Martha to her new place. Make sure she's settled." The guards nodded and escorted Martha out. Once the doors closed, Nicholas turned back to his wife. "I hope this serves as a lesson, Isabel," he said coldly. "Because next time, it won't be Martha leaving." He didn't need to say it outright. The message was clear. Next time, it would be her. The cracks began to show. The Kingsley estate had always been a fortress of power and tradition, but in the days following Martha's departure, an unsettling silence settled over the grand mansion. The air was heavy with unspoken tension, an invisible battle waged between Nicholas and Isabel. Nicholas had sent a message, one that Isabel had not expected. She had assumed that, as his wife, she held the highest position in his life. But in one swift, decisive move, he had proved her wrong. She wasn't the only woman who mattered, and that realization burned. A wife scorned. Isabel sat in the lavish parlor, her fingers gripping the delicate porcelain teacup harder than necessary. The warmth of the chamomile tea did little to soothe the storm raging inside her. Across from her, Eleanor Kingsley observed her with an unreadable expression, her own cup resting elegantly between her gloved fingers. "You look troubled, dear," Eleanor said finally, her voice measured. Isabel forced a tight smile. "I suppose I am." Eleanor took a slow sip of her tea before setting it down with precision. "Because of Martha." Isabel bristled at the name. "Because of Nicholas." Eleanor's lips twitched slightly, though it was not quite a smile. "Ah, yes. My son can be steadfast when he chooses to be." "Steadfast?" Isabel scoffed. "He humiliated me. He chose a servant over his wife. That's unacceptable." Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Did he? Or did he simply remind you that respect is not reserved for the wealthy?" Isabel's fingers twitched against the porcelain. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her piercing eyes locking onto Isabel's. "Let me offer you a piece of advice, my dear. Nicholas is not a man who tolerates cruelty. He is powerful, yes, but he is also fiercely loyal. You would do well to remember that." Isabel exhaled sharply. "Are you saying I should just accept this?" Eleanor studied her for a long moment before shaking her head. "No. I'm saying that if you wish to remain at his side, you must understand what kind of man you married." She picked up her teacup again, signaling the conversation was over. But Isabel wasn't done. She had fought too hard, climbed too high, to be put in second place. And she would not be outmaneuvered so easily. A plan in motion. That evening, Nicholas sat in his study, his fingers drumming lightly against the oak desk as he reviewed financial reports. The glow of the fireplace cast long shadows across the room, the crackling flames filling the otherwise quiet space. But he wasn't focused on the numbers in front of him. His thoughts kept drifting back to Martha. He had called her earlier in the day, ensuring that she had settled into her new home comfortably. She had cried over the phone, telling him she didn't know how to thank him, that she had never imagined having a place of her own. Her happiness was all the thanks he needed. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. The door opened, and Isabel stepped inside, draped in a silk robe, her hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She had the practiced look of someone who knew how to command attention, effortlessly beautiful, enticing yet elegant. Nicholas leaned back in his chair. "Isabel." She smiled, closing the door behind her. "May I?" He nodded, and she crossed the room slowly, settling onto the armrest of his chair. Her delicate fingers traced the edge of his sleeve. "We've been tense," she murmured. Nicholas raised an eyebrow. "You think?" She sighed dramatically, tilting her head. "I don't want to fight, Nicholas. I don't want there to be distance between us." He remained silent, waiting. "I was wrong," she admitted, her voice soft, persuasive. "I shouldn't have spoken to Martha that way." Nicholas studied her carefully. "Are you saying that because you believe it, or because you don't like the consequences?" A flicker of irritation crossed her face before she masked it with a coy smile. "Does it matter? I'm here, aren't I?" Nicholas chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "You're here because you want something." She exhaled, her fingers tightening around his wrist. "I want my husband back. I want us back." Nicholas watched her, his gaze unreadable. Then, gently, he removed her hand from his wrist. "I think we need time," he said simply. Isabel blinked. "Time? You need time to understand the kind of woman I want beside me," he said evenly. "And I need time to see if you're capable of being that woman." For the first time in a long time, Isabel felt a flicker of panic. This wasn't just anger. Nicholas was questioning her place in his life, and she had never been more terrified. Desperation breeds action. The next morning, Isabel woke to an empty bed. Nicholas had already left for the day, no doubt at one of his business meetings or overseeing one of his many ventures. And that was a problem. She needed to act. Quickly. Slipping into a designer dress, she made her way downstairs, where the staff bustled about with their daily tasks. They had always been obedient to her, but now she noticed something different. They no longer averted their gaze in fear. They no longer hurried to get out of her way. She had lost their respect, and that enraged her. "Mom." She turned to see one of the maids standing nervously nearby. "What?" Isabel snapped. The maid hesitated. "There's a call for you, a woman." Isabel's brows furrowed. "Who?" She wouldn't say. Curious, Isabel strode toward the phone in the sitting room and picked it up. "This is Isabel Kingsley." A smooth, unfamiliar voice responded. "Mrs. Kingsley, I have some interesting information you might want to hear." Isabel's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" The woman chuckled. "Let's just say I know things about your husband. Things that might help you regain control." Isabel's heartbeat quickened. Control. That was exactly what she needed. "What do you want?" she asked carefully. "Oh, I don't need anything from you, Mrs. Kingsley," the voice purred. "But I do think you and I have a common interest." Isabel's eyes darkened. Perhaps Nicholas thought he had won. Perhaps he thought he had the upper hand. But she wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The game begins. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the grand estate, but inside, the Kingsley mansion felt colder than ever. Nicholas had left early for business, leaving Isabel alone to stew in her thoughts. The mysterious call from the night before echoed in her mind. The woman's voice had been smooth, confident, dangerous. "I know things about your husband, things that might help you regain control." Isabel had spent her life mastering the art of control. She had learned to manipulate, to maneuver, to always ensure she was on top. But now, for the first time in her marriage, Nicholas had shaken her position, and that was unacceptable. She had a choice. She could either wait, hoping he would come back to her willingly, or she could take action. And Isabel Kingsley was not a woman who waited. The call that changed everything. She locked herself in the study, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping against the desk as she stared at the phone. Finally, she exhaled and dialed the number the woman had given her. The line rang once, twice. Then, a click. "I was wondering when you'd call," the woman's voice purred. Isabel straightened, masking the slight tremor in her fingers. "You claim to have information on my husband." "I do." "And why would you help me?" Isabel asked coolly. The woman chuckled. "Because I hate men like Nicholas Kingsley. Men who think they can do whatever they want. Who think they hold all the power." That piqued Isabel's interest. "Who are you?" There was a pause before the woman spoke again. "My name is Vivian Carter, and Nicholas ruined my family." Isabel blinked. This was not what she expected. "Go on." Vivian took a slow breath before continuing. "My father used to own one of the largest private equity firms in the country, until Nicholas crushed it. He bought out our shareholders, exposed our weaknesses, and left us with nothing. My father, he couldn't take the shame. He took his own life." Isabel's lips parted slightly. She had known Nicholas was ruthless in business, but she hadn't expected this. "And now," Vivian continued, "I want revenge." A slow smile spread across Isabel's lips. "You're telling me," she murmured, "that we have the same enemy." Vivian chuckled. "I believe we do." For the first time since Nicholas had humiliated her, Isabel felt something close to exhilaration. She was no longer alone in this fight. She had an ally. And together, they would bring Nicholas Kingsley to his knees. Meanwhile, Nicholas leaned back in his office chair, rubbing his temples as he reviewed the latest reports. He had thrown himself into work more than ever over the past few days, avoiding the toxic tension that had taken over his home. He had always known that Isabel was a woman who thrived on power, but now he was beginning to wonder if he had made a mistake in marrying her. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. The door opened, and his assistant, Ethan, stepped inside. "Sir, there's something you need to see." Nicholas frowned as Ethan handed him a tablet. "What is this?" "News just broke this morning," Ethan said. "A private investigator has been leaking documents about our company's past acquisitions. Some of them paint you in a less than favorable light." Nicholas's jaw tightened as he scrolled through the articles. Financial records, emails, confidential deals. Someone was trying to destroy his reputation. His fingers clenched around the device, and he had a very strong suspicion who was behind it. A dangerous alliance. Isabel met Vivian in a private lounge at an exclusive hotel, the kind where secrecy was guaranteed. The dim lighting cast shadows across Vivian's striking features, high cheekbones, piercing green eyes, and a confidence that rivaled Isabel's own. "Tell me what you know," Isabel said, taking a slow sip of her wine. Vivian leaned back in her seat, smirking. "Nicholas Kingsley is not the untouchable man he thinks he is. He has secrets, deals that could ruin him, and I have the proof." She slid a folder across the table. Isabel opened it, her eyes scanning the documents. Leaked internal memos, acquisition records, evidence of deals that, if exposed, could tarnish Nicholas's image beyond repair. "This is impressive," Isabel admitted. Vivian smirked. "I know." Isabel tapped her fingernails against the table. "If we do this, we need to be strategic. We can't just destroy his reputation overnight. We need to make him bleed. Slowly." Vivian's eyes gleamed. "Oh, I like the way you think." For the first time in weeks, Isabel felt something close to satisfaction. Nicholas had humiliated her. Now it was her turn. Nicholas strikes back. By the time Nicholas returned home that evening, he had already launched his own counterattack. He had spent the entire day tracing the leaks, calling in favors, and using every resource at his disposal to find out who had betrayed him. And now he had an answer. Vivian Carter, a name from his past. A woman whose father had made bad business decisions and paid the price. And now she was back for revenge. As he stepped inside the estate, he found Isabel sitting in the grand parlor, sipping a glass of wine as if she hadn't just declared war on him. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked coolly. Isabel glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Trying to." Nicholas set his briefcase down and crossed the room until he stood directly in front of her. "You've been busy," he said. Isabel raised an eyebrow. "Oh." He leaned in slightly, his voice dangerously low. "I know about Vivian." She didn't even flinch. "You're making a mistake, Isabel." She smirked. "Am I?" Nicholas studied her carefully. He had underestimated her once. He wouldn't make that mistake again. "You don't win against me," he said simply. "You never win against me." Isabel leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with challenge. "We'll see about that, darling." A slow smile spread across Nicholas's face. "Oh, Isabel," he murmured, "you have no idea what you've just started."